Well, now of the story for all ages, but while you're welcome to come up and enter A Joy of Sorrow in the book while I'm speaking, please don't worry about distracting me. I'm easily distracted, so it's not really a problem having someone coming up. You've often heard the expression, a drop in the bucket. And when you hear that thing, it usually means it doesn't make a difference. I'm just a drop in the bucket. But here's a story I want to tell you about a drop that had a dream, and his name was Higgins. It was a drop of water, and it felt it could make a difference. And Higgins was worried because he looked all around him and saw that, the plants were dry. Maybe Higgins was in California in the drought and realized all these plants were struggling, the trees were struggling, the flowers were struggling, and he was really worried, and he thought, I'm a drop of water, I could make a difference. But the other drops of water said, no, you're just a drop of water, you can't make a difference. He said, I can reinvigorate, I can renew these plants. Look, they're dying. And he said, no, you're just a dreamer, Higgins. It's nothing you can do. You're just a drop in the bucket. Higgins was flowing down one day and saw a bucket. And he thought, I'm really going to take that literally and jump in the bucket. So Higgins runs along, jumps in the bucket, and plonk, ends up in the bucket. And he's there all by himself. Just one drop of water in a bucket. He's getting lonely, and he said, I was hoping others would join. But then his friend, Chris, saw, maybe I miss Higgins. I'm going to jump. So Chris runs and drops in the bucket, and plonk, and there's two of them. And then other drops of water saw this. So they all started following them, just because those first two people were willing to take that leap of faith into the bucket. And eventually they filled up the bucket. And then the other drops of water got kind of jealous and said, well, maybe we should find another bucket. So they filled up a bucket. And eventually there was hundreds of buckets all filled with water. But they still weren't watering the plants. Then a gust of wind came and blew all the buckets over and formed a stream of water that can flow down the hillside and irrigated everything around it. And the grass rejuvenated, the plants rejuvenated, and the trees rejuvenated. So anything when you get together in a group and you get the wind behind you, you can do miraculous things. So that idea, don't ever think of a drop in the bucket as a negative. Think of it as the beginning of something great.
So this is a reflection on renewal. When I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, we had an art class assignment to draw a landscape. I had a farmyard in my mind and created something that was as close to the image in my head as I'd ever been able to do before. I thought that was pretty cool. And my teacher said I'd done a good job. Some months later, I had some other kind of drawing assignment in some other circumstance, and for some reason I decided to do the exact same farmyard landscape the exact same way. And it stunk. Worse, it had been no fun to make, and I was confused at my inability to do something the second time when I had assumed the first time was the hardest part. So I can't really recall now what I was feeling when I decided to duplicate my artwork, but I bet that I was in some way feeling scared or small. Because isn't that what we do when we're feeling small or out of balance? Don't we reach for the familiar, for security, and hope to get by? Our lives are in constant renewal, and on those days when I feel a lightness and a flow, I instinctively know how to do that, to lead with curiosity and love. Khalil Gibran wrote, "Love that does not renew itself every day becomes a habit, and in turn, a slavery." And to Gibran I say, sure, I'm in, that sounds great. But what about those days, like I probably felt upon receiving that second art assignment? The answer clearly isn't complete repetition and habit. That would be the pathway to Gibran's spiritual slavery. But there is no way that the answer in that moment is, take a leap of faith and be amazed that you already knew how to fly. Come on, who does that in those moments? Not me. So the path for me to renewal when I am out of balance has got to be something in between the completely familiar and the utterly unknown. I'm pretty sure of that, but how exactly, in those times of feeling small, am I actually supposed to know which of the familiar to hang on to and which of the familiar to let go of so I have the space to grow? Well, what I'm coming to believe is something like this, that the thing to focus on letting go of is probably not the thing that is making me feel small. It's probably something else. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's an effort and an example. I left a job I had for nearly 20 years some time ago, and I've been moving between consulting and short-term assignments since. It's been frustrating for me not to find something permanent that feels like a great fit, and with acknowledging that my sense of who I am is probably more wrapped up in what I get paid to do than I want to admit. So that's a fair bit to work through, and I do have days of feeling small. But here's the thing, I've been forced away from the familiar professionally and am off balance there. But rather than try to sort out what to be intentional about keeping and letting go of in that space, I decided to focus somewhere else. So for years, the only books I've read have been nonfiction, and I'm happy to talk about why at some point. Earlier this year, I decided I'd only read fiction, and I'd only read what people had left in our mini library in front of our home. It's been wonderful. I didn't come to that table with any feelings of smallness wrapped up in my reading habits. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anybody. But purposefully choosing to change what I had been doing for a long time has been this wonderful breath of fresh air. And it's opened me up to completely new stuff, to curiosity and new ways of looking at the world, of renewal. So in fact, it was a book I recently read that has helped me shape this thinking a bit. It introduced me to the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. Some of you may know him. I had no clue. We are all a patchwork, he wrote, and so shapeless and diverse in composition that each bit, each moment plays its own game. And there is as much difference between us and ourselves as between us and others. There is as much difference between us and ourselves as between us and others. So I read that the first time and I despaired. Doesn't the pathway to that ultimate inner love travel through the land of fully knowing myself and being consistent as a human being? But I'm now coming to actually think it's exactly the opposite. How wonderfully, gloriously freeing it is to realize that I am just a shamble of competing and conflicting senses of myself in the world. Embracing my inner inconsistencies is actually the pathway to renewal in hard times, because even at my lowest, not everything is out of balance if I acknowledge not everything was supposed to be aligned. And so we are all coming back here together for the new church year. It's fun for me to be worship associating again. I've done this for many years now, and I like putting out those familiar candles, and in those really cool handmade clay pots that are kind of hippy-dippy from somewhere. I don't know who made them. I don't know how they came into our lives. Maybe one of you does, but I think they're awesome, and they are unique, and they make me think of the specialness of this place. That familiarity is nurturing for me, as is seeing so many of you and seeing people that I have loved for the first time in a long time, especially David and Solveig being back. But at the same time, I am excited because this new church year will not be the same. And it's not because we have been through the pandemic and we have made the most of it, but it's because we are choosing to try out new ways of doing things, new ways of religious education, new ways of having services twice a month. And that will open new ways of strengthening our covenant with each other. So that feels right. Just enough of the familiar, just some jolt of the new. And to me, that feels like the recipe for renewal. So as I was noodling on all of this week and on the thought of renewal, I asked our 14-year-old Riley what he thought of when I mentioned that word. And his first response was, well, you mean like going to the library and checking out a book again? And I was about to say, no, not that. And then I thought for a minute, and I was like, yeah, exactly that. Exactly like checking out the same book again, as long as that book wasn't really done with you yet.
That song, Whispering Hope, is actually based in the Hebrew scripture text, 6:19. This hope we have, an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which enter the presence behind the veil. And the song refers to that anchor of our soul that so many of us need as we undertake the journey. It's a journey that Chris talked about, where we're going through renewal with what do we leave behind and what do we move forward with, what grounds us as we move forward, what is that anchor that keeps us moving forward. And I have to say, I struggle with the title of that song in this present time, Whispering Hope. Given the state of the world, I need hope to be yelling at me continually that there's hope and renewal out there. But I understand in that religious terms, listening to that still voice, small voice within, that conscience that often is pointing us in a direction of change that we maybe don't always listen to. That still small voice that pulls us forward into places of renewal and hope. But I come from the Presbyterian tradition. I grew up Presbyterian, so I like the fire and brimstone, the yelling and the screaming of hope rather than the whispering of hope. But hopefully we'll try and do both today. Of course, it's the start of the church year, it's the start of the school year, and it's this time of renewal. We go back into school with new hopes for the new grade, for the new classrooms, for our children, for our family, for our grandchildren. We start the new church year, which, as I shared in the video last week, I'm really excited about. I feel this is like a second beginning of my ministry as we kind of come back in person, because, yeah, it was 2 years ago, but all of you saw of me was on this little screen in a little square box. And some of you may long for that time, I don't know. But, like David and Solvay, I've got 3 dimensions to me, if not more. But I think when we talk about renewal, and I really want to explore that throughout this year, because we are trying to renew our religious education program. We are with a new minister here, and even at 2 years, I still feel new. There's a renewal, things will be different. And some of it you're probably going to love, I hope. And some of you may struggle with. But I think Chris did a beautiful job in his reflection of really trying to see that tension and how can we move forward through both the parts we like and the parts we struggle with. But I know at the end of this summer, I don't think all of us are feeling as rejuvenated as we usually are at the end of the summer. At least I know I'm not. And, I just look at the world around us, and I'm concerned. I'm worn down. I'm frustrated. I'm disappointed. And I really was talking to my daughter a few weeks ago, and we were talking about basically the Supreme Court decision to reverse Roe versus Wade. She's an 18-year-old young woman. So she's severely impacted by it. And there was a rally down in the town hall when I was speaking at it, and asked if she wanted to go. And this 18-year-old young woman said to me, no, I'm feeling burnt out. I'm so disappointed about things that have happened. And we sat and we talked about it, and we talked about, and she was born in 2003. So she's growing up with this war in Iraq. She's growing up with the recession of 2005, and even as a young child, she's impacted it because of friends who had family laid off, the financial struggles that many of us experienced at that time. And then I remember having hopes around the Arab Spring in 2010, and then the disappointments of the Arab Spring that happened. And I don't know about you, but myself, I had high hopes for the Obama presidency, and I was extremely disappointed in it as well. There's many aspects of it I was disappointed about. And then we had the Trump presidency, which I think has really undermined democracy. And during this time, we have the Me Too movement rising up in 2017, really addressing sexual harassment and assault of celebrities, of political leaders, and of corporate leaders. And then the Black Lives Matter movement, which has risen up as a way of addressing the discrimination in the criminal justice system, the murder of too many unarmed young men of colour by our law enforcement agencies, the discrimination in the housing market, in education, in healthcare, that too many people of colour suffer in our society. And that's my daughter's lifespan. Yes, I can understand why she's burned out. And I think we've realised that so many young people, that has been their life. Hope, disappointment, hope, disappointment, hope, disappointment. Yet again, things have been exposed that need to be considered. We do need to address the racism in our society, the racism in our culture. We do need to address the sexual assault and too often sexual harassment of women and people who are gender non-binary. But we sat there and she asked me the question, said, is my view of humanity improved in my lifespan, or has it gone down? It's a good question to ask yourself. Has your view of humanity increased as you lived, or has it diminished? And one of my statements of why I went into the ministry was I wanted to explore the human condition in a holistic way. I wanted to learn about and improve the human condition in a holistic way. And I have to say, after 14 years in the ministry, I know less about the human condition than I did when I entered. We are mysterious. Yet Unitarian Universalism, as I understand it, calls us to be a life-affirming, life-renewing, life-enhancing faith. We are a faith of life, hope in this world, hope now, salvation now, not after death. So we are a religion, and I believe this religious community is a community of renewal and hope. But hope needs to be nurtured, it needs to be cared for, it needs to be grown. The German film director Werner Herzog says, whether something lasts or not has nothing to do with whether it's made of stone or steel or wood or fabric. A house built all in wood can be a monument that lasts for hundreds of years because it seduces people to live in it, to use it and maintain it. Eternity depends on whether people are willing to take care of something. In Greece, ordinary white houses are repainted every year. Today we are often told to use materials and structures that are free of maintenance, but no building can be neglected entirely. We need to constantly renew our relationships to the houses we live in, to our friends, to our own bodies, all of time, every day. We need to constantly renew our relationships to the houses we live in, to our friends, to our bodies, all the time, every day. And the American writer Margaret Halsey also said that a commercial society urges its citizens to be responsible for things, but not for people. It is unquestioned assumption of a mercantile culture that things need and deserve attention, but that people can take care of themselves. Those are the words of Margaret Halsey. And so when I think about religious community, but I think the community that's gathered here, both in this place and online, we are a community that cares, nurtures our souls, both individually and collectively. That's what religious community is about, to nurture and to grow us, to give us, to grow hope in us, to renew hope in us, even when it can feel difficult. And I invite you to think, what does renewal mean to you? What would be to renew your soul, to renew your spirit? What does that mean to you? Chris mentioned that he asked Riley what renewal meant to him, and I asked my daughter as well. See, that's what we do. We just plagiarize other people's ideas. She kind of went in a similar tack. My daughter Isla said, she thought, automatic renewal subscriptions that I meant to cancel. I hear laughter of familiarity with that one. And I always think of the renewal of the extended car warranty that I never bought in the first place. I still get 3 phone calls a week on that. But that renewal of things that happen that we weren't intending. I want to think about renewing in the spiritual sense. Renewing is restoring and replenishing ourselves. Can renewal be more than just getting the energy to live as we did before, but live differently, as Chris talked about? Can be a new way of looking, of living, and of loving the world and those around us. I love the idea of renewal. We think of the dry, dusty days during the drought, and then we get this huge rainstorm. And then the sun comes out the next day as the song that we sang in Whispering Hopes. It says, hope for sunshine tomorrow after the shower is gone. Hope for sunshine tomorrow after the shower is gone. But the idea of this rain, because I think there's no more beautiful time in the Bay Area than the day, a sunny day after the rain. And that's a renewal I would like to think about. That cleansing forth, that thing that kind of cleanses us of the everyday stresses, of the harassment, of the everyday frustrations and anxiety. That's the renewal I would like to think about. That renewing rain that's cleansing and the sun that provides hope. So that's the kind of renewal I'd like to think about as we explore this. Mark Nepal, the author, says, he asks us to describe 2 efforts you do every day to affirm who you are and your place in the world. 2 things you do every day to affirm who you are and your place in the world. So since I'm asking you that, I think it's only fair to ask myself that. And there's 2 things I do every day. Well, it's more than 2. But one I do is, many of you know I love the poet John O'Donoghue. And I use this reading of his every morning after I meditate. And it says, may the light of your soul guide you. May the light of your soul bless the work you do with the secret love and warmth of your heart. May you see in what you do the beauty of your own soul. May the sacredness of your work bring healing, light, and renewal to those you work with, those who you see, and those who receive your work. Those are the words of John O'Donoghue, the late Irish poet. And I think having this affirmation, a spiritual practice of affirming ourselves, who we are, and what we do can be really important. And the other thing is your place in the world. And I'm going to take you back to June 2020, when I did my second candidating service here. Some of you may remember it. Some of you probably don't. Some of you maybe didn't hear it. I talked about this idea by this Norwegian Quaker sociologist, Elise Boulding. And she talks about this idea of the 200-year present or the long now. And that's where I think I fit in. That's where I see my place in the world. And the idea is that she thinks about is not to think of the present as a moment, but to think of it as a 200-year, because that is the range of influence each of us in this room has. And I used the example, and I'll repeat it again from 2020. But I thought about this idea, and what she asked you to do is think of the hand of the oldest person who you touched, who influenced you. And think of the hand of the youngest person you'll touch, who influences you. And see yourself as this, on this chain of being, this thing of passing on the influences and values from the older generation to the younger generation. And when I spoke in 2020 in my second candidating service, I gave the example of my gran, Burgess, my maternal grandmother, who was born 1st of January 1900, which was so cool, because I wanted her to live to the year 2000, because she'd have been 100 on January 1st, but she died in 1993. But every new year, that year was her age. And then there was my mum, so I picture my gran, my mum, me holding my daughter's hand, who was born in 2003, and potentially her family, say, born in 2030, 2040, who'll possibly live to 2100. That influence from 1900 to 2100 of peoples whose hands I hope to touch, and people who influence. And I'm talking about my family, but with the religious community, we're an intergenerational community. So the children that we influence in RE, we've got a 200-year influence. And so that's where I see a fit in life. It's not just a place, but this location in time is my influence. And that's my place in the world. My place in the world and my place in time. I think one of the things and I'm putting myself in the older generation here, to influence younger people, is we have been through hard times before. My daughter said that she's feeling really frustrated. She did the gun protest. She started an environmental organization in Austin for high schoolers, but she's feeling burnt out at 18, and I can understand it. I'm not critical of her, but I think what we can do as an older community, or those of us who are older, we can influence the younger, say, yes, we've been through hard times. There was horrible political division in the United States during the Vietnam War, where we were politically divided, and we can get through it. I think many of us feel very bleak at this time about the future and the divisions in there. But we have to remember we have been through hard times before. We've been through Vietnam Wars. My gran went through the First and Second World War and survived those. We can't go through it. We need to give our younger generation hope. Because as my daughter's lifespan shows, she has seen nothing but struggle in her life. And I think the coronavirus over the last 2 years has created a mental health crisis for so many children, youth, and young adults. So we can do that as an intergenerational community. And one of the glories of Unitarian Universalism as a liberal religious tradition is one of our statements is revelation is not sealed. We are a living tradition. We take new ideas. We engage with culture. We put culture into conversation with our values and our tradition and renew. We are a religious movement that keeps moving forward. We are not stuck in tradition. We value tradition, but we're not stuck there. We will move forward as we learn new things, as we learn things from science, from biochemistry, from cosmology. We will, develop new thoughts. We are a living tradition. So that allows our religion to renew itself day in, day out, in, year out, century in, century out. That's what we've done for the last 200 years, and that's what we'll continue to do, I hope. And we're doing it in this community. As Chris mentioned, we're doing it with our religious education program. We're trying to find a new way to build closer intergenerational connections, and we're really excited about it. And other ideas, we're doing other things. We've got a strategic plan that we're bringing into so that we have some focus in how we move forward. These are all ways of renewing. These are things we have not done before. And some of them will work, and some of them will work less well. But it's all part of the renewing. And that's how we move forward as a religious movement. That's how we move forward as a religious community. And I know one of the things that inspires me when I look sometimes in the bleakness of the world, I look at the social justice work people in this community do and people in the religious movement do. And that's inspiring and that's renewing. And so we have to be a place that helps be a sanctuary, as we sang at the beginning, or the choir sang at the beginning, to nurture, to sustain, and to help rejuvenate those activists who are working day in and day out and have been doing it for year after year after year. And ultimately, as Adrienne Marie Brown, the African-American activist, says in her book, Pleasure Activist, she challenges her readers to see justice work not as a slog to get through, but as something joyful and pleasurable. And I think that's what we have to do with so much of our life. We need to not have these escapes from the hardship of life, but we have to find a way of being rejuvenated and excited about our everyday life. So we prepare ourselves in the morning, we go through it, and we find the joy where we can. We celebrate it, we do things that we love and bring joy and energy and celebrations to our life. I think we also need that spiritual practice of seeking and sharing the stories of hope, uplift, and progress. Because there are paths to renewal that can bring pleasure to our life and justice to our communities. So we have to find those stories of hope, of joy, of success that we can celebrate. Because we cannot keep going without celebration and joy. I'd like to finish the sermon by reading by Reverend Gretchen Haley, who I also read a prayer by earlier. And it's on claiming this time for renewal. Though you have been warned and give plenty of explanations, reasons to do otherwise, you have persisted to claim a life of joy and justice, and to carve out this time for renewal of your own heart. Despite the din demanding your attention, luring you towards fear and cynicism, you persist with gratitude for this day. This life that's been given, this chance to begin again. Despite all the forces of fragmentation, the disappointing ways we fail each other, fail ourselves, we must refuse to let grief undo us, or to let our dreams get lost along the way. In spite of all the evidence, we keep showing up at the edge of our own longing. And then we keep going, remembering this duty we have to life. In a greater sense, this duty we have to each other, our children and their children. This hope that is also a choice we make, this promise we fight for, to persist in kindness, persevere in compassion, and prevail in a life that is bound entirely to love. Those are the words of Reverend Gretchen Haley. You have persisted to claim a life of joy and justice and to carve out this time for renewal of your own heart. That's what I invite each of you to consider today and the days ahead. We are in this for the long run. We are a religious movement committed to love, kindness, compassion, and justice. And we need to renew ourselves daily to sustain us.